Where dips the rocky highland of Slootwood in the lake, there lies a leafy island where flapping herons wake. The dowsy water rats, there we've hid our fairy vats, full of berries and of the reddest stolen cherries. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Welcome to the Velocity of Now, with me, your host, Thomas Sheridan. It's the 17th of June 2015, and I opened up there with the first stanza of the William Butler Yeats poem, The Stolen Child, which was originally published in 1888 in a book called Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry. And as this is currently in the midst of a major Yeats celebration in this part of the world, he was from Sligo. Well, he's actually born in Dublin, but his family came from Sligo and he spent a lot of time here and formative years here. There's also a William Butler Yeats occult exhibition at the local Model Art Centre in town, which I'm going to go have to see. I'll do a report on it. I may even get some video for that, so that sounds very interesting. Yeats himself was a member of the Golden Dawn, and he had an infamous, or should we say famous, psychic and magical battle with William Butler Yeats not William Butler Yeats, with Aleister Crowley and William Butler Yeats and MacGregor's Mathers. When Crowley was basically made jump ship from the Golden Dawn. Anyway, we're continuing this theme of magic, mythology, fairy tales, and fairy folklore. It's the Velocity of Now, and my website is thomassheridanarts.com. And from there you can get links to articles at my mythological and archetypes blog, The Dragon and the Triskel. The Triskel and the Dragon, sorry. And I want to talk tonight about fairyland and this idea of being away with the fairies. It's far more complex and psychologically and culturally interesting than it first sounds. When people in Ireland, I don't know how it is in other countries, but when they use the term, he's away with the fairies, or she's away with the fairies, in the modern sense, it's come to mean that they're talking, crazy talk. They're talking nonsense. They're saying things that people don't understand. They're making statements that make them look silly and crazy and overly eccentric. And people say he's away with the fairies or she's away with the fairies. But that's a relatively modern understanding of the term, away with the fairies. It has a very deeper and much more interesting concept. Its original meaning in Ireland in rural folk communities, when they said a person was away with the fairies, what they basically meant was that they were gone. Now, this was used to describe people who had no life in their eyes. We've all met them. The expression, the lights are on but nobody's home. Now, psychopaths sometimes have that look. Actually, very often they do. And that might be relevant to what we're going to talk about tonight. But also, just maybe people are not psychopathic, but you look into their eyes and there's an absence of soul. There's something quite not there. There's no sparkle, there's no sort of twinkle, there's no sign of human vitality within their eyes. They're just like two orbs staring at you. And often these people don't have the personalities also, the depth of personality that we also have. So the eyes are a reflection of the window of the soul. Now, what people in rural Ireland used to think in the old days was that these people had been taken by the fairies, and a sort of a fairy parasite, we'll get into interesting stuff now, from the fairy world was now operating the person as a robot. and they are not quite able to function convincingly in this reality. Do you remember what that African shaman told me? That psychopaths are the demon world trying to invade this world. Well, the demon world and the fairy world and the jinn world, it's all the same. They're just these are just different names for the same phenomena. The idea that there are other forms of consciousness that exist outside human perception that are capable of involving themselves in human affairs, in some cases by possessing or entering the body of a human being in that kind of exorcism style idea that there's a demon or an entity in there that has to be exorcised. And they involve themselves in human affairs, and this is how they get in. Now, but the Irish folk tradition, there was two aspects to this. The first one was that this entity was inside the person, this fairy. The other was that the person who was once inside their own body has been kidnapped and taken to the fairyland or the fairy world, and they're away with the fairies. Now, another thing you often see with this idea of that look in someone's face is that people who have been in cults have that same look in their eyes. They have that, there's just a vacancy there. And often they go into cults and come out looking like that. They didn't look like that when they entered the cult. There was many cases of cults that broke up for whatever reason, were busted, or the cult leader was arrested, and the cult members went back to their families. And even after they were deprogrammed, the parents and the siblings and the friends would all say the same thing, that the person wasn't really in there anymore. The term they'd used in brainwashing and deprogramming terms is cored. It's like coring an apple. And they were not the same person. It was almost like there was an entity inside there trying to be them. The spark of life of the original person was gone. And it happened in the cult. Now, a lot of cults, because all cults, common doomsday cults, flying saucer cults, religious cults, Christian cults, you name them, they're all run by psychopaths, every last one of them. And in many cases of the kind of spiritual New Age cults, a technique is offered called soul retrieval. You see, what happens is the cult leader will generate this idea that the reason why the person entering the cult has all these problems is their soul has gone, was taken from them. And usually either using basically classic mind control techniques, dancing all the time, working all the crimes, altering their diet and constantly bombarding them. Often hypnotherapy is used as well as repetitive breathing exercises. The person is believing that they're getting their soul back. In reality, the cult leader is removing their soul. And the cult leader itself may be a conduit for these pathological entities that walk into the person who's going under the cult indoctrination. You see any cult member, when the next time the Jehovah's Witnesses knock on your door, you meet Mormons, Hare Krishnas, look into their eyes. All of them, the flying saucer cults, look into their eyes, the common doomsday cults, look at their photographs online, their websites. There's something not right there. There's no depth, there's no spark, there's no kindness in those eyes. Often it's a sense of malice. It's sort of like a malignant vacancy. And this is what the term being away with the fairies meant. Now, I got an interesting email from a person, and they said, where have all the fairies gone? Should they still exist? Well, there's still reports of them. There still are reports of them, and in the Irish mythology, the fairies were originally the Tuatha Dé Danann who had to go underground after they were beaten by the Milesian Gaels. And they've been at war with the Milesian Gaels ever since as a kind of a subversive insurgency war. And this is when people are taken by the fairies, are fooled by the fairies, or tricked by the fairies. These are seen as almost like insurgency maneuvers against the Irish people. That's how they're seen. Very interesting stuff. But just you do wonder if people have been reporting fairies when they talk about certain entities. For instance, in the South Sea Islands, when the Portuguese and the Spanish explorers explored that part of the world from Indonesia across to the South Seas, the Indian Ocean areas, they often brought back images of the locals, what they claimed to be the locals. Now, people sometimes think that these strange creatures they showed, people that had no heads and their eye sockets and their mouths were on their actual chest, or they were hybrid human animals. And these reports were brought back, and this one speculation is it was to dehumanize these people. Another one was it was a tall tale to encourage people to go visit these areas, to open up trade links or military links or whatever, exploration links. All that could be true. There's also the idea that they encountered non-human entities on islands that didn't have human habitation, or very primitive humans, regular humans there. And as soon as a Western man shows up, these entities, these whatever you want to call them in your local vernacular, had vanished. They had to go retreat back into what they would call in the Celtic fairy tradition the other world, beyond the ninth wave. This would also not only happen to the actual entities themselves, but their structures, their infrastructure, their buildings, and even whole kingdoms of them would vanish. In County Down, there's a place called the Silent Valley. Now, it was one of these valleys that you never went into because they were believed that the fairies were in there. Remember, the fairies will always try, the story is they will always try to appear and take you, either as sometimes they will appear in the form of this beautiful music that has a hypnotic quality. It sounds like traditional Irish music. In fact, a lot of Irish music, particularly sean-nós singing, is supposed to directly come from fairies. People haven't heard it out in the fields or the woods or the bogs in the old days. And they try to trap you. Another one is a cloud, that's the only cloud in a blue sky if you're walking through these valleys, and a single cloud appears in a blue sky. That was believed to be a sign of one. Another one would be you might have a series of white clouds in a blue sky, kind of like a cotton bud type white clouds with plenty of blue behind them. And I've actually seen this phenomenon myself, and it's very strange. And a very dark, smaller black cloud against even the wind cycle seems to come into the view of where you're staring. And they say that's sometimes could be a fairy as well, how they come to get you. But often the music is the common one. Sometimes they fire weapons at people, like darts and arrows. And the Silent Valley was one of these places that humans only went into, Irish people country folk only went into if they absolutely had to. This also happened in England as well. Prior to the Romantic movement or the Gothic movement, people lived in fear of places like the Yorkshire Moors and the Lake District, all those kinds of places, and Dartmoor, especially in Cornwall, because they had the same resonance. And when the first people to venture into them were the early artists who went in there back in the very early Victorian, late Georgian period, and to paint and sketch these places. And they developed this idea of these were romantic landscapes, romantic places. And often these same artists, such as the Samuel Palmers, the Turner, and the artists that existed at that time doing the watercolor paintings of these places that were considered like off bounds to country people because they were considered to be dangerous, but not just dangerous because something had happened to you, but dangerous because there was other entities living there. That's only when people started to wander into these places. The Silent Valley was believed to have lost. It was called the Silent Valley. It had a different name before 18 1239, when on the 6th of January something called the Great Wind, or the Night of the Great Wind, blew across the east coast of Ireland, destroying thousands and thousands of property. It was the biggest storm ever recorded in human records in the history of Ireland. And the story is, in the Silent Valley in County Down, the wind was so strong that it blew the fairies away. And that's why it's called the Silent Valley, because you no longer hear the fairy music in it. There was a valley also I actually knew quite well, and it was a spooky place even when I was there, near Blessington in County Wicklow, on the Dublin-Wicklow Mountains border. And I used to cycle an awful lot when I was a teenager, and I used to cycle through this valley all the time, and it always had that unsettling feeling about it. And just by chance, years later, I discovered a book which is just basically a social history of Jobstown and that area up around Poulapuka in West Dublin, when it was a highly rural area, that was recorded by a visiting academic when he interviewed some locals back in the 1920s. And these were very old men, and they were so old that some of their grandfathers had fought in the 1798 rebellion for the United Irishmen. So there was a tremendous folk memory. And I was just reading the book, and they were talking about how they used to deliver potatoes or collect fertilizer on horses and carts, or cut turf up in the mountains, and they would do anything to avoid the valley. I can't remember the name of it, near Blessington, that was the same valley that I used to have that used to be scared by. And at that time, because they said it was populated by the fairies and you would not come back if they caught you. They would try to abduct you. This meme is always there, that the fairies are somehow kind of having military operations, interdimensional counterinsurgency operations against the native Irish. And they will take your children, they'll take your livestock, and they'll take you. And even in Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, in the Two Towers, in the part of the book and the movie where Frodo and Sam are with Gollum, and they're crossing the dead marshes, there's supposed to be dead bodies of elves and men and orcs under the water. In reality, they're fairies, and you're told never to look at the bodies in the bog water. And of course, Frodo does, and in the film, it's very well done, where he kind of falls in a hypnotic trance into the water, and he's pulled out, while this sort of like spirit fairy elemental in the bog is there. And you do wonder all about these bog people they find all over Ireland, and in parts they haven't found. I think they've found Scotland and in Denmark and in Germany, in the peat bogs. They're always finding these bodies of people who they say have been sacrificed. Another interesting aspect of this is that sometimes people in the modern sense who have actually encountered fairies, there's one famous case in Scotland where an engineer basically risked his whole career by going public with this, said he had encountered these individuals, and he said they looked just like the bog people. They had the same leathery skin and the same kind of like a Gollum-like look about them. So there you have it. Fairy music, you hear that. It's very beautiful. That means they're trying to seduce you. Clouds in the sky, either a jet black, a very dark, small black cloud or dark grey cloud that appears in a sky full of fluffy white clouds, or a white cloud out of the blue. And the clouds are generally at a lower level than the other clouds. And people lived in terror. They lived in terror in the olden days of seeing a fairy. Up until the 1920s, 30s, people in rural Ireland and in parts of Scotland, if they saw something that they thought would even be a fairy, they would run a mile. This is the kind of power that the mythology has. Now, I read last week from Evan Wentz's book, W.Y. Evan Wentz's book on the fairy faith in Celtic countries from about 100 years ago. And I'm going to read this chapter called The Celtic Otherworld, because remember, there's two aspects of this. There's a kind of a yin and yang, shadow and light, malediction, benediction aspect to this. That the fairy world, you see, this is all very psychologically interesting, even if you don't believe in fairies or anything like that, but it's very psychologically interesting. The idea that there's a counter world to this world, a negative of this world. And in the Celtic tradition, it's called the underworld. The other world, sorry, Otherword. And there's a quote here again by Yeats which says, "In Ireland, this world and the world we go after death are not far apart." By his friend and colleague in the Golden Dawn up here in Sligo again, a guy called A.E. Russell. Both of them were heavily involved in psychic experiments out on Ross's Point Strand. Many go to Tirnanog in sleep, and some are said to have remained there, and only a vacant form is left behind, without the light in the eyes which marks the presence of a soul. See, that's what I was saying, again, this look in the way with the fairies. Now, the general description is, this is according to Wentz, the heaven world of the ancient Celts, unlike that of the Christians, was not situated in some distant unknown region of planetary space, but here on our own earth. As it was necessarily a subjective world, poets could only describe it in terms more or less vague, and its exact geographical location, accordingly, differed widely in the minds of the scribes from century to century. Sometimes, as is usual today in fairy lore, now this book is 100 years ago, so when he talks about it in the contemporary sense, he's talking about a century ago. Sometimes, as is usual today in fairy lore, it was a subterranean world entered through caverns or hills or mountains, or inhabited by many races and orders of invisible beings such as demons, shades, fairies, or even gods. As I spoke there the other week about Ben Bulben, the mountains of Ben Bulben and the caves of Kesh near here, the strong belief that they were entrances into the fairy world. And when you go to these caves, and remember there's lots of them, you do hear the sound of an ocean in the distance. It's been reported by people I know. That's supposed to be the interior world. And the underground world of the sheep folk, which cannot be separated from it, was divided into districts or kingdoms under different fairy kings and queens, just as the upper world of mortals. We already know how the Tuatha Danann, or the sheep folk, after their defeat by the sons of Mill at the Battle of Talta, retired to this underground world and took possession of its palaces beneath the green hills and valleys of Ireland, and how, from there as gods of the harvest, they still continue to exercise authority over their conquerors, or marshal their own invisible spirit hosts in fairy warfare, and sometimes interfered in the wars of men. More frequently in the old Irish manuscripts, the Celtic otherworld was located in the midst of the Western Ocean. Now, this is the thing beyond the ninth wave, and this is interesting stuff as well. I find this fascinating. As though it was the double of the lost Atlantis. Now, that's interesting. It's not. They didn't believe it was Atlantis itself, but they believed it was the double of the lost Atlantis. You see, again, the light and shade, negative and positive. There's always this idea of the two opposing dualist forces in this fairy folklore. And Manaman MacLear, the son of the sea, perhaps himself the double of an ancient Atlantean king, was one of the divine rulers of its fairy inhabitants, and in his palace, where he was one of the Tuatha Danann, was there rather than in Ireland. So the idea of this guy was a king not in Ireland, but in the fairy world. And when he travelled between the two countries, meaning Ireland and this sort of like counter or reverse doppelganger of Atlantis, it was in a magical chariot drawn by horses who moved over the sea waves as on land. Very similar to the idea of both Thor and in his chariot pulled by two goats, and Odin on his 8-legged horse travelling between the 9 worlds. Very similar. This is why the Celts, the ancient Irish and the Norse got on particularly well, because there was so many similarities in their archetypes and how they functioned. And fairy women came from the mid-Atlantic world in magic boats like spirit boats, to charm away such mortal men as in their love they choose, or else to take the great Arthur wounded unto death. The idea that King Arthur, whoever he was, if he existed, was taken to the Isle of Avalon. And in that island world there was neither death nor pain nor scandal, nor save immortal and unfading youth and endless joy and feasting. So it's very similar to Valhalla, endless joy and feasting, Odin's long hall in Asgard at Valhalla, and no aging, no nothing. But the Druidic Island had the same kind of, wouldn't say end time prophecy, but the same kind of sense of fatalistic duty that the time would come when they would return from the underground in Ireland, just like the Enyar, the kind of supernatural version of the Berserkers, would come down and fight in the Battle of Ragnarok. Even yet at rare festivals, like a phantom, High Brazil appears far out in the Atlantic. Now, High Brazil is an island or a country that's seen from Ireland that only appears every so often. In fact, it's even on some maps. Now, this is another interesting thing, because you can have the phenomena where, and I've seen this myself, where a distant place can be refracted by the light, a water vapor in the air in particular, and the light at certain things that can bring a distant place much closer. One time I was at the beach in north side of Dublin, and Wales only looked like it was across about a couple of miles. And people were stopping and pointing and saying, "Look at that, where's that?" And that's what this I'd actually seen this in my life when I was about 11. It's not an extremely rare. In fact, it's even been captured on very high quality video. There is a film, a news report, look it up, of a city that appears at the end of a river beside a bridge in China, and you can see the traffic and everything in it. And that's the reflective quality. In fact, there's even a photograph of Chicago's skyline where you can see down to street level that was taken from, I think it was either Cleveland or Cincinnati, I think it was Cleveland, across one of the Great Lakes. It should not have been visible because it was on the other side of the curvature of the earth. But because of this strange refractive phenomena, Chicago appeared much, much closer than it actually is. So this High Brazil thing is interesting. It may even be some of the islands in the Caribbean being seen from the west coast of Ireland through this reflective light quality. It could be an island that surfaces and goes under every so often. It could be even Brazil. That's, of all the names it has, Hybrasil. Anyway, it appears out in the Atlantic. No later than the summer of 1908, it is said to have been seen from the west of Ireland, just as the strange invisible island near Inishmurray. That's very close to here as well. A very important island, Inishmurray. It's loaded with megaliths, Viking and early Irish and monastic settlements. Very important island. I don't think anybody lives there today. I think there may be one or two people still lives there. But the island itself is a gold mine of archaeological and cultural treasures, even though it's basically just a small flat island. Inishmurray, the island near Inishmurray, was believed to be inhabited by the invisible gentry. And I spoke about them a few weeks ago, the gentry. These are the race of an aristocratic race of highly intelligent people who are supposed to live inside Ben Bulben. Is seen, and they're also believed to be connected to Druidic Island. Is seen once every 7 years. And too many men of intelligence testify to having seen High Brazil at the same moment, when they have been together or separated, as during the summer of 1908, for it is to be explained away as an ordinary illusion of the senses. Nor can it be due to a mirage such as we know, because neither its shape nor position seems to conform to any known islands or landmass. The Celtic otherworld is like that hidden realm of subjectivity lying just beyond the horizon of mortal existence. That's beautiful writing, that. Which we cannot behold when we would, save with the mystic vision of the Irish seer. Thus, in the legend of Bran's friends, who sat over dinner at Harlech with the head of Bran for 7 years, 3 curious birds acted as musicians, the 3 birds of Rhiannon. This is in Welsh mythology now, which were said to sing the dead back to life and the living into death. Very similar to the fairy music. But the birds were not in Harlech. Harlech is the Welsh name, the old name for Wales. They were out over the sea in the atmosphere of Rhiannon's realm in the bosom of Cardigan Bay. And though we might say of that other world, as we have learned from these, the 3 birds of Rhiannon, and as Socrates would say, that its inhabitants are come from the living, and the living in our world from the dead there. So a swapping of souls. People who die or lose their personality or soul in this world are flipped over into the other world, and the same thing happens to the entities on that world when they are either somehow lose their consciousness from their body or are dead. They flip over into this world. This is why you lot better be very fucking careful with your ayahuasca. You trendy... Because I've met no one who's taken ayahuasca who ended up a spiritual person. You go to all their pages, you see half of them are still promoting neo-Nazi white national stuff, Jew bashing, and they're still as angry as ever, and they have their obligatory little window saying the DMT, the spirit molecule, is their favorite film. So you better be careful when you go down to South America that you're not being taken back by the entities or the fairy world in the Amazon as revenge for the conquistadors. In fact, I've heard Graham Hancock very, very irresponsibly try to make out that it was the reverse of the conquistadors in that they were bringing spirituality back to the West. Well, let me tell you, Mr. Hancock, there's 2 kinds of spirituality. And this is one of the reasons I'm very, very, very cautious and dubious about people from the West taking ayahuasca, because you don't know if you've come back. Anyway, I digress. In Irish manuscripts, the other world beyond the ocean bears many names. It is Tir na Nog, which basically translates of the land of youth. Tir Inambio, the land of the living. Tir Tarnagir, the land of promise. Tir Nagal, the other land. Or Magmar, the great plain. I like that one. Or Magmel, the plain agreeable, meaning the happy plain or the contented plain. When they say plain, they don't mean like a plain, like the rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain, like a flat piece of land. They mean another plane, like another realm of existence. But in this Western otherworld, if it is what we believe it to be, a poetical picture of the great subjective world cannot be the realm of any one race of invisible beings to the exclusion of another. It is all alike: gods, Tuatha fairies, demons, shades, and every sort of disembodied spirit find their appropriate abode. For true it seems to surround and penetrate this planet, even as the X-rays interpenetrate matter. It can have no other limits than those of the universe itself. Now, this is a fantastic idea. You know, when we hear Forteans, including myself, saying, well, UFOs, demons, shadow people, Slenderman, tulpas, angels, they're all the same. Ghosts, they're all the same thing. They're all the same. There's no distinction. It's just that we see them and call them these different names, but these are the other races in the other world. You know what I mean? Like there's Chinese people and black people and European people and Asian people and all the different races here. There in the other world, these are manifestations of almost different psycho-ethnic paranormal states, if you want to take it that way, in the other world. And like some people are even, some races, such as the Laplanders, are very close to these kinds of hybrids that are on this earth. This is why, if you look at my blog, The Triskel and the Dragon, there's an article about them, how these people, the Laplanders, were considered satanic because they were very, very different than other Scandinavians, and still are. They're short little fellas who also look like those bog people. And also, the men in black, according to John Keel in his books, when they took out pictures of different races from all over the world, nearly everybody who pointed to a race that looked like the men in black pointed to Laplanders. And it's not an exclusive realm of a realm is certain from what our old Irish manuscript records concerning the Fomorian races. These, when they met defeat on the battlefield at Moytura, remember I told you about Balor of the Evil Eye recently, at the hands of the Tuatha De Danann, retired altogether from Ireland, their overthrow being final, and returned to their own invisible country, a mysterious land beyond the oceans, where the dead find a new existence, and where their god king Tethra ruled as he formerly ruled this world, and the fairy women of Tethra's kingdom, even like those who came from the Tuatha De Danann of Erin, or those of Mananana's ocean world, enticed mortals to go with them, to be heroes under the king, and to behold them as assemblies of ancestors. It was one of them who came to Conla, son of Con, supreme king of Ireland, and this was her message to him: the immortals invite you. You are going to be one of the heroes of the people of Tetra. You will always be seen there in the assemblies of your ancestors, in the midst of those who know and love you. How deep is that? This person from the other world, an emissary, visiting the son of a supreme king of Ireland and telling him that you could come and live with your dead ancestors in the other world. And with the fairy spell upon him, the young prince entered the glass boat of the fairy woman, and his father the king, in great tribulation and wonder, beheld them disappearing across the waters, never to return. Again, Tolkien took so much from Irish mythology. I told you that the reason why he couldn't really go on about it, because of basically Ireland and Britain were at war during the 20th century. But this is exactly what happened at the Grey Havens at the end of the Lord of the Rings, where Frodo, Bilbo, and the elves leave for the Grey Havens on a boat made of a swan. To enter the other world before the appointed hour marked by death, a passport was often necessary, and this was usually a silver branch of the sacred apple tree bearing blossoms or fruit, which the queen of the land of the ever-living and the ever-young gives to those immortals whom she wishes for her companions. Now, before I go on, where did Arthur go? Arthur went to Avalon. What is the Anglo-Saxon for apple? Athelin. And the queen of the underworld offers a sacred apple. Avalon and Athelin. Though sometimes, as we shall see, it was a single apple without its branch. The queen's gifts served not only as passports, but also as food and drink for mortals who go with her. Often the apple branch, the Athelin branch, produced music so soothing, we're back to the music, fairy music again, that mortals who hear it forget all troubles and even cease to grieve for those whom the fairy women take. For us there is no episode more important than those in the ancient epics concerning these apple tree talismans, because in them we find a certain key which unlocks the secret of that world from which such talismans are brought, and proves it be the same sort of place as the other world of the Greeks and the Romans. And you have the story of the Golden Bell, Fraser's book, the golden bell, the branch that you extended that allows you to go into the mystical other world. With this parallel between the other world of the Celts and that of the ancients seemingly established, we may leave poetical images and seek a literal interpretation for the animistic idea about those realms. The rites of prospering, as conducted in the mysteries of antiquity, furnish us with the means. And in what Serbius has written, we have the material already. Taking the letter Y, which Pythagoras said is the lifelike symbol, with its dividing ways of good and evil, and also very close to the Nordic rune of life. It's basically a Y, the letter Y, as the mystic symbol of the branch, which all initiates like Aeneas offered to Proserpine in the subjective world while they're out of the physical body. He says of the initiatory rites, he, the poet, could not join the rites of Proserpine without having the branch to hold up. And by going to the shades, he, the poet, means celebrating the rites of Proserpine. The passage is certainly capable of being of but one meaning, and we may perhaps assume that the invisible realm of the ancients, which is called Hades, is like the Celtic otherworld in the Western Ocean. Ferryman, you know the story, the Styx, and also like has its mythological counterpart in the Elysian fields to the west, reserved by the Greeks and Romans for their gods and heroes, and for the happy otherworld of the Scandinavians, Iranians, and Indian mythology. That's Iranian post-Persian, post-Islam. Iran, Persia, has a fantastic, eventually we will get to this at some point, pre-Christian, pre-Islamic, pre-Zoroastrian fairy fate. That's for another time. What time is it? We have 20 minutes left. It must then follow that all the realms, though placed in different localities by various nations, epochs, traditions, scribes and poets, even as the underground world of the Truide Danann in Ireland, differs from that ruled over by one of their own race, Manannán, the son of the sea, are simply various ways in which different Aryan peoples have had it looking at the one great invisible realm of which we have just spoken, and which forms the heaven world of every religion, Aryan and non-Aryan, known to man. And if this conclusion is accepted, and it seems that we must be, merely on the evidence of the literary or recorded Celtic fairy fate, our psychological theory stands proving. This Wentz book is actually very much based on Jungian psychology. It's one of the reasons I like it so much. Now, I can't read them tonight, but there's loads of stories, such as the Voyager Bran, the son of Fairbal, Cormac's adventure in the land of promise, and so on, where the hero, like Orpheus in the underworld, goes to the fairy world, and the experiences are told in a very interesting way that when they get there, it's basically a dump. And this has also been reported in modern Irish fairy folk tales, that when people who have been taken by the fairies, they fell asleep on fairy grass, which has probably had psilocybin mushrooms in it, or they had been taken by the fairy fate people after being hit with a poison dart or eating the fairy food, Apollon. They come back saying the same thing. John Keel wrote quite a good stuff about this in his books. Basically, it's a shithole, the fairy world. It's run down. It's in a bad way. It's not this mystical paradise. It has poor climate, poor soil, poor weather, and basically a sense of disarray, where you might have in Ireland well-tended fields with stone walled borders and hedgerows like you'd have in this part of the world, Ireland, England, Scotland, and people would tend to the land. It's like a barren kind of wasteland in the fairy world. And this brings us back to why they abduct people and why they have this counterinsurgency against us. I also suspect, as others do, that this idea of our ancestors and our friends being over there in the other side is a lie given to us as part of a kind of a interdimensional propaganda. It's almost like, the West is the best. In fact, when many Irish immigrants went to America in the early days, the first ones, they would have had that psychic feeling that they were going to literally turn an oak. Especially many of them would have not spoken English. It's only until the 1920s that the first Irish speakers went to the Americas. And they would have literally felt like they died and landed in a new realm. In fact, so many of them died on their way to Canada. The mouth of the St. Lawrence River in Canada has an island that's literally a grave of thousands and thousands of people who never even set foot on Canadian soil. These were the coffin ships, the people dying of disease and not being allowed aboard. They'd have typhoid and cholera, and they would be quarantined on these islands. And so their experience there would be just like the ones who were seduced to the fairy world. They were promised all this new land and this world of new hope and opportunity and the gold in the streets. And when they got there, they died in a typhoid ward on a depressing island in the mouth of the St. Lawrence River or somewhere else off the coast of the Carolinas, never having reached Tirnanog. And that's even why when the Irish went to, and the Scandinavians, interesting enough, when they arrived in New York, they continued on. Scandinavians mostly settled in the north, Midwest, Wisconsin, places like that. The Irish kept pushing towards San Francisco, pushing west, always going west. And this would have been the subconscious high Brazil, the search for the land above the ocean, the land of milk and honey. But it never worked out. It rarely worked out that way. I think Coppola in that film, that's a very deep movie, The Gangs of New York. I think while Bill, the butcher, played by Daniel Day-Lewis, is actually an Odin archetype. He's one eye. He knows everything that goes on. He controls everything, and he travels to the 5 points, the 9 worlds, to battle the enemy, which is the Irish. The Irish, on the other hand, have landed not in the land of milk and honey, but in this appalling place. And you see, this is how psychologically it's interesting, because it's almost like there's a predestined cultural sense of doom in how you perceive what your racial or your spiritual fate is. The English always talk about, and it's that even World War II posters had it during the Battle of Britain, that one day Arthur will return from Avalon and save England in its darkest hour. Now, what happens also in the Irish mythologies when these individuals returned back from the fairy world, and it's reported in the modern thing in terms of missing time, is that they come back thinking they were only a short period away. You see, there's nothing new under the sun. Only a short period away, only to come back and find that they were sometimes not only years away, but decades and even centuries. That they would the stories of the heroes coming back and looking all over Ireland for their friends and finding their great-grandchildren, being shocked at how the country has changed. New towns have been built, roads that didn't exist are now there. And it's exactly the same thing as the UFOs and the missing time phenomena. That when they enter into the fairy world, that time has a completely different clock speed, which is an interesting idea anyway. When you think in terms of the human brain, doesn't have a clock speed as such. The time that we experience is imposed upon the human brain. But when you can actually change the clock speed of the human brain, that's when you're having a good time. Time flies quickly, and that's in moments of great intensity, time stands still. And so this is what happened to these people when they returned back from fairy world. They were shocked to find out that that Ireland had changed completely. Now, there's other ways of looking at this, the idea of at the immigrant who can never go home. In fact, I was always amazed when I would go to America, when I was in America, and even in England, when I would meet older Irish immigrants, they would talk about Ireland as exactly when they left it, as if the chronological progressions which had happened in America or England or Australia or wherever they are did not happen in Ireland. In fact, I can even remember when I was over there and meet younger guys, say who'd been in America for a few years, who decided to go back to Ireland after, say, maybe 8 or 9 years, would be back in New York a couple of weeks later. And they would always say the same things. I got back home and everything had changed. All my friends had gotten married and had kids and didn't want to hang out. They couldn't hang out. They had all kinds of responsibilities like mortgages and jobs. And all the clubs and places I went to are all gone and not there anymore. It's the strangest thing. And I want to say to these people, are you aware that chronological progression happens in the place you left as well as the place you're currently in? And a lot of them don't know that. A lot of them are genuinely shocked to find, like Irish immigrants who left Ireland in the 50s, they're old people now, or they're genuinely shocked to come back to Ireland and see that there's computers and, mobile phones and laptops. They still expect it to be like 1950s. It's like their brain shut off. So maybe in these folk tales, there are ways of telling people that if you emigrate, you can never come home. You can't go home again, that old adage. This is the idea of the fairy world and mythology as a whole being a compensatory mechanism, which I believe it is, for life in this world to help us deal with things that our brains may have difficulty dealing with. So allegory, poetry, art helps us to deal with it better. But I also believe that there's a real possibility that there is another world outside this one. There's far too much folklore and legends and cultural stories and mythologies that tell the same story of another world that's akin to this one. And we have an innate relationship with that other world. And okay, I may have a lot of problems with people like David Icke talking about his reptilians, mainly because he's not very well educated in any of this stuff, and he just sees a picture of a lizard or a gargoyle and says they're reptilians. However, he may be performing for some of these people, particularly in England, a very powerful archetype in that he's keeping the idea, he's talking about this outside our five sense reality, he's keeping unknowingly, I might add, unknowingly and unaware, keeping the idea in people's minds of the other world beyond this world. The doppelganger of the reality we inherit. And so maybe he's unknowingly performing this idea of the archetype, as is people like Rosemary Allen Guiley, who talk about the jinn and keep the idea of the jinn going, as are people who talk about shadow people, as are people who talk about sleep paralysis and night hags, as are people who go on ghost tours, as are people who contact the dead at seances, as are people like me who create machines to try and kidnap demons. There's not, just as an experiment to see what happens, not necessarily believing, just the very idea that these concepts exist. And even popular literature, everything from Yeats, well, Yeats is a firm believer in the fairy world, everything from Yeats to Tolkien to even George Lucas and Star Wars, keeping the idea of this reality just outside this reality, where the other aspects of us exist. This creates a schism. And this schism is that we're one side of a force and these entities on the other side are another side of the force. And hence why any attempts to communicate with them generally end up with people in psychiatric hospitals committing suicide or going crazy, or taking drugs, hallucinogenics, and not fully understanding the consequences, or using Ouija boards and not understanding it's a hotline to the dark side. We need emissaries between this reality and that reality. This is what the druids in the past, this is what the shaman are and still are, and where real shaman exist. I'm not talking about some fella in Glastonbury who calls himself, Crystal Dicky, who calls himself a shaman because he did a course. I'm talking about the real thing. People have subjected themselves to enormous pains and have a history of being deep into this stuff in their culture. They were the ones who handed the olive branch and almost acted like conductors between the energies of either side. The druids very much were involved in this. In fact, the idea was that the person in some druidic traditions, if there was a person away with the fairies and off in fairy world, that the magician, the druid's wand, either hazel or particularly willow, was believed to have tremendous magical power, could be extended and charged by the druid, and the demon cast out, or the entity or the fairy or the other side cast out, and the original person returned, like the scene in The Lord of the Rings where the King of the Rohan gets that where Gandalf goes, I cast you out. Now, Saruman had gotten into him, but the king existed somewhere else. He didn't die. So we don't have that. We don't have this idea. What we have are Catholic priests doing incredibly dangerous things, like performing exorcism on people who are possessed, getting the entity, the demon or the devil, whatever, out of the possessed person, and then it all seems great and happy. It all seems wonderful and sweet. But what happens is that entity has jumped into this reality. It wants that exorcism. That was shown in the movie The Exorcist, where he goes, take me, and then he realizes what the game was. Pazuzu was trying to enter into Georgetown in the United States, and Father Karras grabbed Pazuzu in a kind of a transitory state and killed himself by throwing himself out the window, stopping Pazuzu from entering into this reality. Karras was a Catholic priest who became a druid in his final seconds on Earth. We don't have that anymore. We have people going down in their thousands now to the Amazon, to Peru, to take ayahuasca, and we have no idea what this is going to be about. And they're coming back home, and God knows, are they coming back as themselves, or are they coming back with something in them? So remember that. The next time you meet a person, and we all meet them, that has that lack of look of life in their eyes, that a person that you could never, because we've all met them, then you could never have a deep conversation with them. You didn't even get to know them. Now, I'm not dehumanizing these people. These people have probably been damaged. Maybe in childbirth or something happened, and they're away with the fairies. They're gone. And so, if the theme of this tonight's show is to recapture the true meaning of that statement, he or she is away with the fairies. Thank you very much.